Welcome everybody to the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. I have the great pleasure today of speaking to Dr. Naomi Murphy. Dr. Naomi Murphy is a consultant clinical psychologist who specialises in the treatment of trauma arising from betrayal within families or institutions. She spent 20 years doing this in prisons with people who had previously been written off as untreatable. She is trained in a number of psychological therapies and is an accredited sensory-motor psychotherapist. She balances out the impact of doing a job that's often steeped in emotional pain with an interest in energy psychology, meditation, and compassion. Naomi is the co-editor of Treating Personality Disorder, creating robust services for people with complex mental health needs, Murphy and McVeigh, and the host of the Locked Up Living podcast, which explores barriers to wellbeing in institutions and ways to overcome them. She has given evidence to the APPG for men and boys and sits on the APPG, or All-Party Parliamentary Group for Restorative Justice. She is also a homeschooling parent. Welcome, Dr. Naomi.
Thank you very much for such a warm welcome.
Yeah, pleasure, and it's a real honour to speak today. We've been in contact for just under a year since Seen and Heard started, really. And originally we connected via Piers Cross. And for those who don't know Piers Cross, he's a coach, and his film Boarding on Insanity has recently been released, which looks at the boarding school syndrome and the wounded leaders that have come through the system. So thanks to Piers for connecting us originally. But we've got an opportunity.
Piers' podcast is great as well, isn't it?
Yeah, the Evolving Man podcast is a really good one, and I very much enjoyed being a guest on your podcast, the Locked Up Living one. I think you really shine a light onto institutional settings and the impact that they have on people. So I'd love to get into that a bit more in our time together today. But I'd love at the start to kind of get a bit of background, really, and to understand a little bit more about where you came from and how you came to do the work that you're now doing. So would you mind telling me a little bit about how things were for you in the early days, your childhood, what brought you into this world, and how was that for you?
Yeah, sure. Well, perhaps as a change from some of the other guests you've had, I didn't go to boarding school, but my dad was in the Air Force, so we lived a very transient lifestyle, moving every year or two. And actually, if we weren't moving, typically our friends were moving. So it felt like, until I went to university, that I didn't know anybody for longer than sort of 2 or 3 years tops. I was quite envious of people that had these lifelong friendships of, people that they'd known from primary school. And I think growing up in the armed forces, it is associated with quite a lot of family dysfunction and things like alcoholism and difficulties coping later on in life. And actually, I felt I was quite protected from that because I came from quite a small, close-knit family where I was lucky enough that I did feel safe and loved during childhood. But I remember I was always kind of like really hacked off every time my dad would come home and say, we've got to move yet again. And I would be quite upset by that whole thing. And I did have friends who went to boarding school who were only around during the summer holidays, but it did make me at times have conversations with my parents about why did they go to boarding school and we didn't. But I have to say, I would never have wanted to have that as my choice because I enjoyed the safety and comfort of being able to come home each evening. But it did get me thinking from even quite a young age, really, what would it be like to be growing up and not have your family to come home to each day? And then I was living in Germany when I just finished my O-levels, as they were called at the time, and having to take my options for A-levels, and knew that we were going to get posted back to the UK halfway through my A-levels. So my family, we did explore going to boarding school at that age, and I went around various boarding schools, not the most elite, I would hasten to add, but we did go around quite a few boarding schools, and I just really felt like it wasn't something that I would want to do. Having had the freedom of living at home, I felt like they'd be quite restricted. They either felt like they'd be either really strict, or there seemed to be like a lack of discipline with sort of teenage pregnancies and problems with drug use associated with those schools, which made me feel like it wouldn't be a very safe environment to be in. And in the end, my a family friend offered that I could live with them for the final year of my sixth form. So that's what I chose to do, which I was very glad I did. But I think it has had me thinking about, the role of our peers in teenagehood, that actually as teenagers we're looking to our peer group for support, but we still need our parents for some sense of guidance. And I was quite frightened of what it would be like to be in an environment where my peer group was just either in this really rigid environment, or where people perhaps lacked any sense of discipline. So for me, it didn't really make me come to value what it's like to have that safety and security of a family to be there through difficult times. And I think that even though I hated moving, I wouldn't have traded that for boarding school, even though I was a sucker for all the Enid Blytons and all those kind of things too. In reality, when you think about what it would be like as a child, it's not very appealing.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you. Sorry to have a slight delay on the line there, but no, I really appreciate you sharing that. I think it's a really challenging dilemma for military families, sort of they sort of call it missionary, mercantile, and military. There's sort of three sectors, if you like, that have people globetrotting, whether it's mercantile, working for an oil company, or missionary working for the church, or military. Is that real dilemma for families of whether to give what they might consider sort of stability ahead of connection, with the family unit. And I really believe that all parents try and do their absolute best when they make decisions. It's just often framed in like a societal context or their own personal experience. So it sounds really positive that your parents listened to your wishes, and whilst you looked at these options, you chose the one that was right for you.
Yeah, I think so. And it's not. There are obviously you're weighing up as a parent. You're weighing up those two different balances, and moving around every year or two is not ideal for children either. But I think, and certainly my experience of teenage years was kind of feeling a little bit on the margins. Whatever school you went to, you got the wrong accent, the wrong version of the school uniform because fashions change, and so I felt that I didn't quite fit in, at times during my child and teenage years. But in some ways, that's been a strength in adulthood, because it has meant during my working career that I've been able to entertain ideas that other people wouldn't be able to entertain, because I'm actually quite comfortable with not going with the flow and not being one of the herd, but being able to think for myself about what I think's right in that situation.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I know that when you were speaking, you touched on peer attachment, peer relationships, and I think certainly the book "Hold On to Your Kids," the Gabor Mate and Dr. Neufeld, but it really opened my eyes about the challenges of people who are peer attached, if you like, once that connection with parents breaks down for whatever reason. Could be parents aren't there physically, emotionally, could be boarding school, could be another sort of reason. But once young people start to seek their emotional needs and physical needs to be met by people of the same age with an immature, emotional makeup, it becomes very challenging, and that kind of shifting sand underneath them appears. There's nothing to anchor to. Could you speak to, obviously you moved a lot, but you had that secure base at home. In your work, how have you seen that sort of peer attachment show up?
Worked with a lot of people where there's been a sense of absence of parents, and so then and children look for those attachments. So in prison, actually, and you see it in kind of like stories of the young girls in places like Rochdale, where they've sort of gravitated towards these older men that have exploited them, passing passing off as boyfriends when clearly it's just purely exploitative. But you see the similar sort of position with young men as well, actually, that young men get groomed into gang behaviour. They're given cigarettes or drugs, a small amount of money, and they start feeling they're managing to impress these older youths, and they really gravitate. They want that acknowledgement and validation from these older individuals, but often if their motives are not good, if they're wayward characters, the young boys then find themselves getting involved in activities that are not conducive to a healthy lifestyle. And so I think when children don't have parental figures there, they do seek to find that from somewhere else. And what you really want is for your children to be looking for that from somebody who's a good, positive role model, not from people who are already on the margins of society, engaging in destructive behaviours, don't know how to cope with their emotions. We learn how to cope with our emotions from our parents, ultimately, certainly to start off with. We expect to be we learn to expect to be comforted, we learn to label our emotions from our parents. But if we're not really allowed to have emotions, we just act out our emotions behaviourally, then we can find out that can be a bit of a recipe for disaster in adulthood, when we're having to, without any guidance, and having to cope on our own independently.
Yeah, thank you. I really hear you on that one. I think certainly, within boarding schools, particularly, it's been largely sort of starting to phase out now. But in the past, because the ratios of pupil to staff were often very high, particularly in the boarding houses, the older pupils were used as basically the front line sort of disciplinary and teaching structure. And so you had, potentially not well-meaning older boys and girls being given total authority and power, whether it be the fagging system or punishments, or just sort of informal structures. And I remember very much you were always looking to the year above, and then as soon as you moved up a year, you were always looking down on the year below. So it creates that real sort of hierarchical structures. And speaking to people who've been through the social care system, through group homes, etc., it's a very, very similar, very similar situation. Very little between them. Well, thank you. And for you then, as you developed through, you saw out your education, staying with a friend to see through your exams. What happened next for you? What were you drawn to?
Okay, so when I went to university, I only applied to do psychology in one place. Actually, I applied to do history everywhere else, and thought I don't want to be a history teacher. But I went and did psychology, and all the stuff that really fascinated me was trying to make sense of things that appear on the surface not to make sense, but actually they always do. So I was interested in why people do really bad things. Don't really believe in the idea of people being born evil, and so I, during my teenage years, probably read far too many crime books. Really kind of curious about why would somebody behave in such a abhorrent way. And I think the more that you understand about people, the more that you understand that everyone's behaviour makes sense. We might not like it, but often it represents the individual's best solution that they can find for themselves. It might be very, very maladaptive. And so that was the elements of psychology that I was really drawn to, the trying to understand the behaviour that's beyond the mainstream normal, if you like. So I knew when I left university that I wanted to be a psychologist, an applied psychologist of some sort. I did work in a prison for about 9 months, but while I was there, I was like, these people are all traumatized. They've had really damaging relationships with their parents. They've mostly been abused. What they need is the opportunity to heal from those experiences, and punishment and shame is not the way to manage that. And I'd applied to train as a clinical psychologist at the same time, but it's a longer selection process. And I was lucky enough to get a place as a clinical psychologist, so that's what I chose to to do, but still combined the two. You know, I've worked with people who've committed offences for the best part of probably about 25 years in different settings, but ultimately it's, and now I work in private practice, but you still, the knowledge is still relevant because people are people, and people's behavioural problems, their distress, you know, often it has very similar origins, so that the circumstances might not be entirely the same, but often, you know, it's about people trying to find a solution to deep pain and not being able to find that in a way that we might immediately see is a solution, but typically the acting out behaviour is a solution to a lot of distress.
Yeah, thank you. And then the old adage of hurt people,
Absolutely.
and you feel it rings true through your work and your experiences, that you said that the rates of abuse amongst the prisoners that you work with was very, very high. We see similarly, tracking from our surveys, around 35% of those who went through the boarding school systems were physically or sexually abused within the institution. And of course that, you know, creates first a dissociative state, and then, you know, say coping strategies, patterns, sort of what were once solutions that then become problems for society, for them, etc. So yeah.
I think you see a lot of, you know, I think the further I've got into sort of secure services, the higher up the security, the more grotesque the crime, for instance, you would see an increase in the level of brutality that somebody had experienced. But I think we dismiss a lot of experiences that are still quite harmful to children. So I think abandonment is a massive issue, and it's like, you know, two parents separate in divorce, and they might do that in the most amicable way possible, and the relationship isn't right for them to stay in, and actually staying in the relationship might also be damaging to the child because of having to live in a household where there's a lot of conflict and tension. But actually, just even if that process is managed well, the child can still feel a little bit abandoned by that, and the parents have to work really hard to help the child understand that it's nothing to do with them, and it's about the parents not getting on and making sure that the child doesn't get brought in as a pawn. So, you know, you were talking earlier about how parents send their children to boarding school not for malicious reasons, but actually they're trying to do their best by their child, and actually, but there you've got an abandonment. So it's inevitable that the child will feel abandoned at being taken to boarding school at, you know, a young age, and being left there for weeks, months at a time. But that's not because the parents intended that to happen.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really important distinction. And the other one, what was very important as well, is you've worked with an awful lot of people who've been subject to abuse when they were young, and there's this awful sort of misconception that, you know, if you've been abused, for instance, that then you might go on to abuse others. It's a challenging one, isn't it? Because many who do abuse were abused, but not all those who were abused go on to abuse. You'll have seen a great deal of this in your career. How do you tackle that sort of challenging argument?
I think that's really great that you've highlighted that, because those who go on to abuse are within a tiny minority. It's just that of those who do cause harm, that they've typically had harm inflicted upon them. But I think, you know, I don't think any of us were put on the planet in order to cause harm to other people. And I think one of the things that I've often asked people to think about is treatment when in prison, I'd say, was very much about enabling people to connect with who they were meant to be when they were born. You know, that actually the person that's drinking or being violent isn't the person that it's not in their own interest, never mind the interest of anyone else if they're behaving with violence. It damages their own integrity as well as the integrity of somebody else when they behave with violence. So asking people to really try and connect with who they were supposed to be when they were here, and that person that was put on the planet was intended to be able to experience their vulnerability rather than to have to push it away with aggression or drink, or whatever other coping strategy they're using. You know, I just don't believe that anyone was put here, born bad, and it was inevitable that they were going to turn out a bad penny. I think, I'm very much a believer of the nurture side of things, in terms of why things go wrong.
Yeah, thank you. I think as someone who experienced a number of adverse childhood experiences, if you like, the impact, the coping strategies, if you like, come out pretty early on, and then they're sort of doubled down on in teenage years. You really sort of cement them in there, and by the time you go out into the world in 20s and 30s, they'll likely be in place until some sort of breakdown, catastrophic event, physical, emotional health, job loss, loss of relationship, whatever it is. And we tend to see that in our work at Seen and Heard. It's that breaking point that comes later, where the light gets in, when the work starts to be done. Okay, well, who was I at the point at which I was hurt so badly that I chose this strategy for myself? And in that work, we unlock the inner child, the part that was left behind, and then someone can move to sort of something like wholeness again. But I think I very much agree that it's largely the environmental stuff. But so there's a lot of work done now around generational trauma, or epigenetics, that the environment triggering sensitivity, perhaps, that may be laid down in the nature. What's your experience on that?
I think typically the people I've worked with have come from families where there's been a lot of trauma and neglect. So at an individual level, it can be hard, without digging into the science of everyone's DNA. Just in terms of the stories, you can understand why, if the grandparents were also abusive or neglectful, how the parents of your client have ended up behaving in ways which are not desirable, which are harmful. And I think quite often in therapy, people move from a position of perhaps feeling quite angry. Sometimes people come in they're very loyal and protective of their parents, and it comes at a cost to themselves. And actually, I think people need a period of being annoyed with their parents and feeling let down and disappointed in what they received, in order to be able to then move to a position of, I suppose, conscious forgiveness and understanding that actually they deserved better as a child, but their parents were also doing their best, and their best wasn't good enough, but their parents were to some degree disabled by their own experiences during childhood. But I think it's really good that you've highlighted the fact that most people don't go on to cause harm themselves, because I think that fear of causing harm can be a barrier to people exploring their adverse childhood experiences, because they fear that if they engage with understanding their past, that somehow they're going to be unleashing a part of themselves which is destructive. And it's a shame, because a lot of people do wait till they have a catastrophe to come for therapy, when in fact actually feeling ill at ease within oneself and wanting to understand, just wanting some sense of inner peace is just as good enough reason to come for therapy. You don't have to be turning your life into some kind of shit show in order to justify or warrant therapy. And I think my experience of working with people from boarding school backgrounds is they often feel like they're whinging or complaining about something that anyone would just be sucking up. I absolutely, you hear the most heartbreaking stories, as you must do too, and people feeling that it's somehow their fault and they somehow weren't strong enough for managing those situations, but actually they are circumstances that would have impacted on most children, if not all children.
Thank you, Naomi. Yeah, I think I really hear that. Particularly amongst the people who suffered, the worst kind of sort of physical, sexual abuse in institutions and things like that. The shame is such a precursor to not speaking up. But the judgment of, oh my God, if I tell someone this is what happened to me, they will think I will do that again. Which, of course, as you say, in the vast majority of cases, absolutely not going to happen. They're going to be as far away from that as possible. They might be overcompensating the other way, and but that shame, that judgment is keeps people silenced for a long time, and then the harm, like the tennis ball pushed under the water, at some point it will pop up somewhere else. You can only push things down for so long. It will show up as you referenced, addiction, um, sort of damaging behaviours, etc. Yeah. And so as you moved into your career, then, so you got a place and were able to train as a clinical psychologist, and then you mentioned that you worked through institutional settings before coming to private practice. Can you tell us a little bit about what you saw in the system, and and what that gave you as sort of gifts for your life, your understanding?
Yeah, sure. So my very first post was it was actually I'd been there as a trainee, and then I chose to stay there, and it was in a specialist service, and it was labelled for people with personality disorders. I absolutely hated the label, personality disorder. I think it's such a pejorative name, but I also recognise that by acquiring that label meant that people were able to access treatment that they wouldn't have otherwise accessed. So what a horrible situation. If you accept this label of personality disorder, we'll give you treatment for your personality disorder. But really, I understood personality disorder as being a reaction to repetitive trauma during childhood. Everyone I'd worked with had experience of trauma and neglect. And and I would say that stands across my entire career. And when people say, "Oh, but some people are just born that way," I think, well, I haven't met them in my time working in secure services. So I worked in a medium secure hospital, and I worked setting up the first mental health inreach team in Leeds Prison, and then went to develop a treatment programme in Whitemoor Prison, which was for men who were labelled as untreatable psychopaths. So kind of like they were seen as being hopeless cases who'd been written off, and they had to have a label of psychopathy, so to be identified as psychopathic, which it's measured by an assessment tool called Hare Psychopathy Checklist. So they had to score as psychopaths to get into the project. And when I first went there, I did think, there are a lot of very old men who'd been in prison for many, many years, decades, quite a few men in their 50s or 60s, who'd been either chucked off treatment programs, barred access to treatment programs because the treatment was believed to make psychopathic men worse, or they refused to engage with treatment. And what I found was they were all had very, very similar experience, in fact, more brutal experiences, but very similar experiences to the men and women that I'd worked with in the medium secure hospital. So actually their psychopathic behaviour made perfect sense, and I would see psychopathy as being a particular form of dissociation. So I don't see it as being a constant for people, very few people. But I would say that somehow a switch would get flicked, and then they would go into this sort of psychopathic dissociative state characterised by quite a cold anger, rather than this hot anger. So it could look like the acts were acts of brutality for no apparent reason, but there was always a reason. And really the focus needed to be on providing trauma-focused treatment, because the across the board, the people I've worked with have had this awful experiences, and it can be really hard when you read about somebody's offence. You think, I'm going to meet this monster, they've done something really, really awful, and then you meet them, men and women, and you're able to see the little boy or the little girl that was really badly hurt and harmed, and somehow have to find a way to hold in mind both the perpetrator and the victim at the same time, and help them manage to merge both, but also to ultimately be the healthy adult part to their character. So that part that didn't get the chance to grow up in a healthy way. I can't remember what your question was now. Sorry, Chris.
Well, it was really just the sort of the learnings from the institutional setting, that part of your career when you were working in these before private practice, really sort of what you'd taken away. But you really spoken to that with psychopathy, the advanced state of dissociation, and being able to see the crime separate from the person, separate from the victim, and being able to hold those.
Yeah, and I suppose the other stuff is about how organisations behave. So organisations don't really change much. They're resistant to change, and I think organisations get bruised in the same way, psychologically bruised in the same way that humans do. So when something bad happens in an organisation, the organisation can choose to deal with it by tending to the wound and acknowledging what the harm that's happened and trying to offer space for recovery. But typically what organisations do is clamp down, try and stop acknowledgement. And you see this, don't you, in the stories of, it's heartbreaking to see how hard people who've been harmed within institutions like boarding schools, how hard they have to work to experience validation and acknowledgement of what happened to them, and to, they rarely receive a full apology or an apology that has any sense of meaning to it, because if there was a full apology, they wouldn't be having to fight to get to that point in the first place. So you can see that organisations don't do well. We know from the literature on organisations that organisation culture doesn't change without some really profound acts and acknowledgement, and mostly organisations choose not to do that. So, in my experience, that was hospitals and prisons, but you could equally apply that, I think, to boarding schools in terms of there may be some change, but does the culture change? Often probably not.
Yeah, thank you. I really hear you on the organizational side of things. I think what we come across most with schools, which is our sort of area, if you like, is there are those who are able to offer an unconditional apology. Most will offer a conditional one, which is, really sorry that happened to you, but that was the other lot. That was we
Yes.
went around then. They might have changed names 2 or 3 times, trading names, which was a common trick for sort of getting out of trouble in the past. But even the insurance industry and the legal industry have made it very clear that an apology is not an admission of guilt. You can apologize unreservedly, and we've seen this recently with the church and Smythe and all the stuff that's been in the press. You can apologize unreservedly without liability. So that's the first thing, is validating that experience was wrong, what happened to you, and it shouldn't have happened. Now, beyond that, of course, we sadly have an adversarial legal system, etc., that whether it's criminal or civil, but straight off the bat, if someone is seen and heard and for what happened to them, and they acknowledge that wasn't okay, that is a big step. But it does take, as you say, the leadership challenge that required to change a culture or an organisation. Piers' film we mentioned at the beginning about wounded leaders, people who've come through systems, institutions, who go on to lead, often very, very dissociated, would have probably ranked quite highly on the psychopathy scale, as we know that there's often many things kicking around that, our CEO, psychopaths, etc., which I appreciate is pretty glib language, but the dissociation part will be true. It will just be the level of, and I wanted to touch on that because as soon as you mentioned the cold anger, I went, ooh, that's me. I was always told, before I had my breakdown and did my healing work, that it was like the air left the room when I turned. There was like the stone wall went up, the eyes went dead, and that's when sort of it was always very cold, whatever happened next, and I could feel it in my body, and the room could feel it energetically. It's a very it's quite a scary thing, and I had to do a lot of work to stop that happening. But ultimately, it was dissociation learned at a very young age. At some point, the walls went up. When you're working with people, whether it's in institutions, private practice, and they're very, very dissociated, but you're trying to get them to see that inner child, see that part of them that was hurt. What are the don't say techniques, but modalities, tools, techniques? What are the things that really start to game change for people in your experience?
Yeah, well, I think if people are dissociating in sessions, they're not going to be doing anything productive. Actually, also, the biggest thing I think is that people need to feel safe, and if they're not feeling safe, then they're not going to be doing anything productive. They're not going to retain it afterwards. And for me, I think training in sensory motor, I've trained in a number of modalities, including EMDR, schema focused therapy, compassion focused therapy. But for me, doing training in sensory motor psychotherapy was really helpful because it's a massive emphasis in there on grounding and enabling people to feel safe. And actually, a lot of therapy requires people to really dig into the narrative and really drag up the painful parts of what's happened. In sensory motor psychotherapy, that's considered to be a sort of a kind of violence in a therapeutic sense. So you'd be working with somebody and you're studying what's going on in their body as they're talking. And as soon as you get signs of dysregulation, that's the point that you're stopping at and you're working on the dysregulation. So if you were, I don't know, talking about a road traffic accident, for instance, you wouldn't have to get into talking about the fact they had to cut you out of the car. Instead, you'd be noticing that your client is getting agitated and they've got their shoulders are raised, there's tension in their jaw as they're talking about setting off for work that morning. And that's the point that you'd stop at and work at. So I think that's been, for me, really, really helpful to think, actually, we don't need to go to those darkest places. You can do the therapeutic work with the slivers of anxiety or distress that are coming up much earlier on, and really helpful. So yeah, I think kind of like a lot of grounding. Then I think also parts work, getting people to, I mean, you referred to the inner child earlier, and I think when we don't think about parts, we tend to, if we're full of vehement emotion and we're really angry or upset about something, we kind of feel that is us. We're the sort of person who gets really angry at this sort of situation. If we can start thinking about the different parts to ourselves, so we can start thinking that under these circumstances I've become really angry, but that's because that's my hurt child trying to lash out and protect me. It makes it easier rather than thinking of that is me, Naomi. I always have temper tantrum. I'm always flipping my lid when something happens. But if we understand that it's linked to a child part that is trying to defend us, and then also a lot of people from that have been to boarding school, like many others, lack compassion towards themselves. They might be way more compassionate to other people, but really find it hard to be compassionate towards themselves. And I think helping people begin to talk to themselves compassionately, give themselves compassionate touch, that reassuring touch. I mean, I found it amazing when I learned that our skin responds to our own touch, our own gentle touch, in the way that it would if somebody else were to touch us. And the same with articulating our words, that if we talk kindly to ourselves out loud, that's actually pretty powerful. So, encouraging people to think about how they engage with themselves. Would you hang out with somebody who was berating you and calling you useless or stupid? No, you wouldn't. But actually, many of us do that with our, those parts of ourselves that can be quite critical and put us down regularly.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. All of that strikes a chord with me. I think on the sensory motor sort of technique that you talked about. I'm an emotional freedom technique practitioner, and very much follows the idea that when we're doing really traumatic memories, if we're using EFT or matrix reimprinting, we drop in before the event. We drop in at the point at which the body entered freeze, flight, fight, flight, freeze, flop, whatever it might have been. And we often the words are never spoken about it. And it can be very helpful, particularly if there's sort of a criminal case around it and things like that, where details can be challenging to sometimes share with therapists and things. Is you don't need to do the details. You just need to know how did the younger version of you, what happened, what happened in the body, what did you make it mean? That day, what was the belief that you took on that day that you've carried, ever since? And then work on the feeling in the body, whether it's the knot in the stomach, the tension in the jaw, using breath work, using sort of uh, uh, somatic techniques, etc., to start to move it. And so the body keeps the score, as Bessel van der Kolk says.
Yeah, and I think the beauty of things like EFT, the emotional freedom technique, and breath work, is that it gives people a lot of control themselves over what's going on inside their bodies, I think. And if somebody's overstepped your boundaries in some way early on in life, actually what better than to give people the way, a way to be able to make sure that they can produce safety at any point in time for themselves. So I think there's something really appealing about these approaches. And, that's not to say that people don't necessarily need to do some other forms of work at times, but I think the more that we can equip people with the tools to be able to keep themselves emotionally regulated, any therapeutic work that they do beyond that is going to be an awful lot easier, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Absolutely right. If you're not going into emotional dysregulation or dissociation, you're going to get a lot out of a talking therapy session, etc. But I certainly spent decades effectively running rings around counsellors in a dissociated state, quite a manipulative dissociated state, and I didn't get very far. I felt validated, I felt heard. That was important at that point in my journey. It was all I could manage. But ultimately, looking back on it now, I can see what I was doing. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And we're talking about institutional setting. Of course, the title of your podcast is Locked Up Living podcast. And could you tell us a little bit more about how, was that because of your work there? Was it things that were going on in the world outside, or your interest? What was happening there?
Well, the idea for it came during COVID.
Okay,
so
right.
when we all had way more time than we do ordinarily. But I suppose when I worked in the prison, I was really conscious of, and one of the things I didn't get around to saying earlier was that in institutions, emotions are emotions are contagious anyway, but within an institution, they get really heightened. And when you're working in prisons and hearing about most of the people I worked with had committed crimes like rape and murder, sometimes dismemberment. So working with really horrific crimes. Then you're also, these people who've committed these crimes have also been people who've experienced the most brutal kind of treatment themselves. So you're steeped in, pain, disgust, shame, fear, sadness, all these really painful emotions. And I would see people who worked in prison who were quite cynical and quite jaded, and I think I don't want to turn into that. I want to protect my own sense of wholesomeness. So I think I worked quite hard on well-being even when I worked in the prison, to try not to become hardened and not to lose my compassion. And prisons are also, and I think most organisations are actually, I see the same in sport, that institutions are silos. They try and keep everything in-house. They're very reluctant to learn from other areas, even though there might be some amazing things going on in other areas that would really benefit you in the role that you're in your organisation. And when I worked in the prison system, I was often bringing in people from very, very different walks of life or different specialties. Sometimes I think probably the prison governors thought, well, why the hell have we got this person coming in? But actually, I think that there was learning to be had from those. It's like once you achieve competence in an area like psychology or coaching or what have you, in some ways, what more you can learn in your own niche area is fairly little. Hopefully we all carry on growing bit by bit, but actually you've got way more to learn if you choose to learn something that's only tangentially related or even quite differently related. It might be that you learn something that's so mind-blowing that it enables you to create something very, very different in terms of your practice. And so I was always very keen to learn from other areas. So when I started the podcast, I'd been having a conversation with David Jones, my co-host, who I didn't actually really know before we started the podcast. He phoned me because of my role as the clinical director in the FENS unit to ask me what we were doing for the prisoners in their cells during the lockdown. And so we ended up having a conversation about wellbeing, and then we thought it would be great to take over an issue of the Prison Service Journal. And then a friend of his who was a journalist said, why don't you start a podcast? And it was, I suppose, relatively early days podcasting, 2020. And so we were like, yeah, well, that's an easier ask for people, asking people to come and chat about something they know about, rather than expecting them to write something, which is a lot more time consuming. So we started the podcast, published our first one in January 2021. I am actually an introvert, so, excuse me, putting my voice out there, if it'd just been me on my own to start off with, I would have taken it down straight away because I was mortified at this audio it was at the time. We didn't do video at the time, putting it out there. But we've focused on how do you protect your well-being in organisations. So we look at some of the barriers to well-being that you get in organisations, and they tend to be quite fairly typical across a number of organisations. So the same themes crop up, like lack of emotional intelligence of the organisation, or a lack of attention to feelings, and overwork, and try to find solutions to some of those problems. So we've had a lot of conversations about the criminal justice system because we have a lot of contacts in that area, but also we've probably had about 8 or 10 conversations focused on boarding school, and boarding school does overlap a lot, I think, with the criminal justice system. We've spoken about elite sports, the police, compassion in the NHS, and on the face of it, we've had a lot with whistleblowers, actually, because those conversations, again, it's people get treated in very similar ways no matter what their industry is. And I think we all have a lot to learn from those people that have spoken up. So yeah, there's lots of it. On the face of it, we look like there's not much holding our conversations together, I don't think, but we seem to get the same people listening all the time. So even if I'm just following my niche interests, it's appealing to some people.
Yeah, thank you. I think that what I saw across the episodes that I've seen, and who's on the ones I haven't seen, I can really feel the threads. I think, whether it's institutional settings, whether it's the trauma that underpins them, and the humanity that underpins systems and challenges and institutions and all the rest of it, it all boils down to sort of human beings, doesn't it, and human behaviour. So I find that it's a brilliant podcast. Thank you for putting it out there. And it actually, to be honest, it's a bit of a blueprint for for yours, Piers' podcast, etc., for what we're trying to do with this, which is, a lot of it is for personal development, the learning from people. And there's a lot of fear that comes up with putting stuff out there. I've had a lot of that myself, to overcome speaking out. We were taught at school, you don't speak out. That is the, no grassing, no speaking out. And so everyone remains silent. And so, people get sicker.
Well, I'm full of admiration that you're doing one on your own, for starters, because I think that is harder to do. But I also think, don't you think a podcast is just an amazing way to get to have really great conversations? Also, I mean, I don't get paid for it, but it's the best part, well, not the best part, but it's, a highlight for me of the fact that I can have these conversations with really amazing people. And I feel like I've met so many really brilliant, kind, compassionate, innovative thinking people over the last 4 years that I wouldn't have had the chance to do if I'd not been doing the podcast.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think it is a lovely thing to do, and we'll make sure that in the show notes for this episode that you can find Dr. Naomi Murphy's podcast, which is the Locked Up Living podcast. And there was something else that we chatted about, in our sort of over the last year that we were both really interested in, which was, and you touched on it earlier, kind of maladaptive coping strategies, maladaptive behaviours, ways that early years trauma sort of ends up playing out, the solutions, if you like, that we put in place that stay with us until we look at them. And for that, particularly addictions, for me, workaholic, alcoholic, I was a gambler, porn and sex addiction, I was a heavy smoker, overate, every addiction I could get my hands on, really, apart from hard drugs, which I just about stopped short of. I consumed hungrily to sort of feed the ghosts inside. But could you speak to your experience in your career, or any personal understanding, whatever, around what it is about addiction and trauma that are so sort of intrinsically linked?
Yeah, I mean, people often speak about the emptiness, don't they? That if you're not allowing yourself to tolerate your emotions, that if you're evacuating your emotions, that you are left with a vacuum inside you. So people would often talk about emptiness and that being unbearable to experience, and almost trying to do anything to fill it. So I would see very much as, I mean, I hate the idea of addiction as a disease, because I do very much see it as a coping strategy. It's a way to sort of soothe emotions, and probably to some degree, everybody, does this. Whether for some people it might be a bit too much exercise, a bit too much food. I mean, Jim Alford writes about excessive appetites, and if it's an excessive appetite, then that's when it's a problem. But it just really seemed to be soothing. When we don't feel good enough, it can be a distraction from who we are. I mean, some addictions are slightly different. So I think the workaholism, for instance, I think is very much driven by trying almost to prove that we're good enough, except for we never get there. So if for all of those people who are perfectionists, it's like, and people who are perfectionists typically say, I'm not a perfectionist, and that's because they feel they never achieve perfection. But to anyone looking on, you can see the perfectionism that is really compelling them to do more and more and more, and it's exhausting just hearing about what they're doing sometimes, or watching them. But that sense of soothing, and also quite often for people there's a sense of a need for excitement. So if people feel a bit dead inside, that sense of excitement can make them feel invigorated and alive. And I know when I was working with people who were misusing substances, that one of the things seemed to be, it wasn't even so much the substances they were getting, it was the process of acquiring the substance that was thrilling. Working with people with sex addiction, where they're kind of like constantly having to up their game, and then finding themselves doing things that are really at odds with who they saw themselves as who they really feel they are as people. So really letting themselves down. And there's a self-fulfilling element to it all, of course, as well, is that many people are full of self-hatred and self-loathing because of what happened to them, somehow blaming themselves. And in some ways the addiction allows them to keep on feeling bad about themselves, because they still feel like they're a failure, or they're getting it wrong, or not being a good human being, because as long as they've got this addiction there. And I think compassion obviously is a massive help when thinking about addictive behaviours, because actually if you can be not compassionate as in you can do whatever you like and it doesn't matter, but having a bit of compassion about why you're using the substance or the behaviour in the first place.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just as you were speaking, was those sort of different aspects, like the filling a void inside, the excitement part, the self-fulfilling cycle part. I was looking, actually, because I had so many addictions. Actually, I think they serve different sort of benefits for me, if you like. The drinking was very much around social anxiety and relaxation.
Yeah.
The eating was an actual physical emptiness in my stomach.
Yeah.
And then the sex porn stuff was upping the ante. That was, over the years, you just think, geez, how did I get here? Some of the high risk stuff, it's really, but you just need more and more to get the same same connection, same anything. So, yeah, I think from within, ex borders, workaholism, alcoholism, often up there, and then food, because the food was strange in an institution. It's so policed. Often it was so bad. A lot of people were supplementing with sweets and sugar, stuff from the tuck shop, or you sneak it in, etc. That many I know have very poor relationships with food, either to get some control back, so eating disorders, or just binge eating to try to make you feel something. So those are the ones that most commonly sort of crop up in the discussions. But from people who've experienced an institutional upbringing, are there any others that you see a lot that you can really sort of draw the line back to how they grew up, perhaps, and the addictions that then come?
So, well, that is a good question. I mean, I think often in, many of the people I've worked with, it's kind of like drink and drugs in their teenage years. When I was working in prison, much less of the sort of workaholic. There was kind of like over industriousness, if you liked, but it wasn't really manifest so much as workaholism, which I see a lot of in private practice. But I also wonder to some degree, in prison, I have worked with people who were in boarding school who ended up in prison, but actually the majority of people who end up in prison come from quite impoverished backgrounds, often quite criminogenic families, not always, but that's certainly there. And I think, when I think about the clients that I've worked with who have depended on workaholism, quite often it's been because school doing well at school was a way to feel like you would get love, also, or validation from parents. Now, many people in prison, their parents didn't value school in the same way, so that perhaps didn't become ingrained in them as a strategy for developing. But I can certainly see that in clients in the community, and I think that need to be loved. I think actually I'd go beyond that. I think parents' job is to communicate to their children that they treasure them for their inherent qualities. Too many people, I think, learn that they can be loved so long as they do well on a test, if they do well on the sports pitch. But actually, as kids, we need to know that our parents delight in us just by our existence, because we're funny or thoughtful or whatever our particular quirky, whatever our attributes are. I think in prison, I've seen people who obviously their sex addiction became a thing because they'd tried to identify with the perpetrator in order to feel less vulnerable. And, that's not something you see so much in private practice in terms of the sex addiction is much less damaging to other people apart from partners, for instance. But it's not the sex itself is not harmful to somebody else beyond the beyond the cheating, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's certainly been a big part of my journey is looking at those addictions. But ultimately, they all went down in one go. It wasn't like I had to play whack-a-mole with 6 addictions. Once I'd met the younger parts of myself that had been so hurt that they needed to find these things, they all fell, one after another. I found that they then sometimes shifted onto healthier things. Suddenly you're an exercise addict, and for me it was surfing or self development. Got addicted to that, is the way it goes. But I think I can definitely feel it loosening its grip, and it was the
Well, you said that tongue in cheek, but actually, I just like to add to that. I do think that is quite common, and especially I think for people who work as in the sort of wellness sector, so people who work as therapists or coaches. And I think that's another form of perfectionism. That constantly reading something, trying to improve on themselves, but ultimately what you're communicating, and not you in your case perhaps, but what you're ultimately communicating is you're not good enough as you are, and where do you draw the balance between healthy self-improvement and this drive, because this compulsion to keep reading something else or doing something else because you feel like you're not good enough as you already are, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it certainly does. Yeah, I could definitely resonate with some of that. But as we start to bring things to a close, Naomi, I just wanted to check. We talked about such a range of things over the last year, and we've looked at most of the questions we kind of wanted to tease out today. But is there anything you feel you want to say? Anything that you feel like we touched on but didn't get the airtime it needed?
Oh, you asked such great questions, Chris, in terms of the breadth of them. So I suppose I just really want to emphasise that need to have compassion for yourself, and maybe also think about the idea of forgiveness. So I think forgiveness is one of those concepts. I've sort of chopped and changed my mind over time over whether you need to forgive. But I think what is really clear is to holding on to anger and vengeance actually is self-destructive. And I don't know who it was that said it, revenge is like drinking poison and expecting your enemy to suffer. I think it's been attributed to a few different people. But I think that's not to say that people shouldn't feel angry, but I think that can't be your end point for your therapeutic journey, that there is something about having to focus on what's serving you. And I think anger is an emotion that's designed to, help us get the oomph to protect ourselves. And actually, when the threat is no longer there, in some ways, if you're continuing to be angry, you're continuing to allow somebody to have power over you. And, I would really like to couch that in nuance, because I'm not saying that we have to forgive everybody, but I think we sometimes need to find a way to let go of things if it's still continuing to eat away at us inside. Then we haven't probably done enough work on it, and we probably need to find a way to be able to let go. That's not to say that the person shouldn't have done whatever awful thing they did, that they shouldn't have had to face consequences, because I do believe that people should be accountable for their wrongdoing. That's why I think it's still important to prosecute very old men or women when they've been abusive, because I think symbolically that matters. But actually, for us ourselves, we are best served when we are in a state of warmth and love and compassion. And it's, that is the antithesis of anger. When we're angry, we become closed, we become tight, we're all scrunched up in order to make ourselves hard. But actually, when we're warm, we're empath, and when we're full of love and compassion, we're expansive, we're relaxed, we're at ease, and that's actually serves us much better than when we're in a state of anger.
Well, thank you. Powerful words to sort of start to finish on. I think, as you say, it's quite toxic and it leads to physical and emotional harm. The list of my autoimmune conditions and will tell you that holding anger is toxic and needs to change. As you say, often something I like to recognise is that when wrong has happened to us, we can understand it without being accepting of it, and while it explains everything, it doesn't. I'm mixing my words slightly. I'm trying to remember the quote itself, but I think I'll have to leave it for next time. From those ones it's just gone from me. But it'll come back at some point.
Well, as you were talking, I was just thinking about, I work a lot with whistleblowers, and some of those people understandably become intent on wanting their sort of David beats Goliath moment. They want justice. They want an acknowledgement that they've been harmed in some way. They want to see justice done. And actually, these big organisations are often not going to do that for some of the reasons you outlined earlier. And actually, sometimes the best way that you can get your own power back is just to shine doing you in whatever way you do it. And actually, that gives you your power back. And you make the organisation or whoever's harmed you insignificant in some way by shining yourself. And sometimes I think that's the best we can achieve. We're not necessarily going to all have a post office moment where we take down the post office or whichever other bad guy has hurt us. Sometimes just focusing on what is within our control, which is how we feel, is the most that we can do.
Perfect. What a way to end. Thank you so much. And for people who want to get hold of you, we'll make sure some links there. But what's the best way to reach out to you?
Well, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn and X. Certainly you can find me via my website alternatively, which is octopuspsychology.com. Thank you.
for psychology.com. Well, it's been a real joy today, Dr. Naomi Murphy, to have this time together. We've covered some really good ground, and I also just personally want to thank you for keeping in contact with me and Seen and Heard for the last year. You've helped us a lot. You had me on the podcast, and you continue to advocate for all people who've had difficulties in childhood and in life. So I want to thank you for your work in that area and for continuing to sort of champion and support the cause. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me on. I was really honoured to be invited on. I'm really glad to be able to interact with you and support the work that Seen and Heard are doing. I think it's really, really important stuff.
Cool. Well, on that note, we shall say goodbye. Thank you very much, Dr. Naomi Murphy, and thank you so much for listening or watching today. This has been the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. I'm Chris Braitch, and wishing you a very good rest of your day. Goodbye.